Hello, everyone. I would like to greet everyone in this panel and in our audience today. Good morning, good evening, depending from where you tune in from. It is a great opportunity to meet here today with all the researchers and parties involved in the formulation of the language of the becoming city. We will talk today about this project that represents an exceptional transdisciplinary endeavor, which is synthesized in the book, The Language of the Becoming City, published by JOVIS in Berlin. My name is Sorana Radulescu. I welcome you here today. And I'm here on behalf of the publisher JOVIS. Honored to greet the team that was all involved in the project. Talking about the book is a great lesson about understanding and shaping the urban environment. It gives us clues on how our surroundings can be transformed by the people who interact with them and people who aspire to transform it into a more just environment. Furthermore, I would like to mention the book reveals how specific imaginaries that stem from ideas of equity and inclusiveness might produce another type of city entirely. A more livable, more equitable, more sustainable city that we would all enjoy living in. So you see, the book confronts us with manifold new concepts of global relevance. And all that we will discuss today in this intercontinental meeting. It is a truly global meeting that spans between Europe, Africa, South America, and Asia. And furthermore, the authors of the book, they all contributed with their different backgrounds, not just their contributions from different continents, but also different backgrounds that come together here from the architecture, art, urban anthropology, political theory, and sociology fields. And they all contributed to this overarching investigation on spatial justice. And we will gradually meet these different actors involved in this complex project. In the first part, each one of them will offer some insight on his or her specific role in the project. And in the second part of the panel, we will let the conversation unfold and reveal further interesting aspects. Also, the audience is invited to participate and pose questions at any time. So first, I would like to give the virtual stage and invite Caroline Vanjitsuki-Hato. Caroline, I would describe her as a researcher and a doer. She's a visiting fellow at University of Oxford and a visiting researcher at the African Center for Mitigation in Society at Wits University. But also, she's the founder of Frame 45, which is an independent organization that curates innovative urban practices with a strong social justice impact. So Caroline, a warm welcome from my side. You wrote the preface of the book, and your role today is similar to start the panel by putting this research and the book into context. The stage is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the kind invitation to speak about this book, which I read with great interest and enjoyed very much. And today I want to just talk a little bit about what the book meant to me as I read it, and how I think it makes an important contribution, sort of urban studies and creative urban studies that try to address some of the sort of very complex issues that we face in cities today. And the language of the becoming city begins with a simple yet very powerful question. Who has the right to imagine the urban future? And the question is subtle and critical. The authors do not ask the question those of us who work on the built environment often ask, which is who has the right to be in the city, or who has the right to be part of the city's future. Rather, they ask who has the right to imagine the future of the city. And imagination is a really powerful thing. Ursula K. Le Guin wrote, the exercise of imagination is dangerous to those who profit from the ways things are, because it has the power to show that the way things are is not permanent, is not universal, and is not necessary. And so it is this sense of possibility and speculation that makes this book an important contribution to 21st century urbanism. And the authors, and we've heard from the introduction by the publisher, come from a range of very many different disciplines. They're engineers, they're architects, planners, designers, artists, writers, photographers, geographers, anthropologists, and they all collectively reimagine transformative, radical, and just urban spaces in a variety of contexts and countries, in Brazil, in Sweden, India, and South Africa. So the 21st century is the century of the city. We all know that. We all know that 2/3 of our world will live in urban areas by 2050. But what the numbers hide is the complexity of urban dynamics. As some cities in developed regions decline, others, mostly in Asia and Africa, will single-handedly fuel the urban growth of the future. Across the world, technological advancements are transforming how poor communities mobilize through WhatsApp, social media, how they bank through phones, and access resources. But even with these innovations, inequality continues to persist, and it rears its head in unlikely societies like Sweden, which once prided themselves on being one of the most equal countries. Working at the intersection between the global north and the global south, reality and imagination, the individual and universal, the authors of this book achieve a rare cadence. Through the exploration of the universal concepts of conflict, of the commons, of networks and hybridity, they bring to life local communities, their struggles, agency, and imaginations, like the Swedish Assyrian community in Sweden, social movements in the Cape Flats, sex workers in Vasco da Gama, Goa, a local nonprofit working in a favela in Rio de Janeiro, who dare to imagine a more just city for themselves and those most marginalized. Using words, photographs, and drawings, the authors weave together their stories of their interlocutors and the spaces that they occupy. And through empathy, imagination, speculation, and creativity, new vocabularies emerge on how ordinary urban dwellers navigate the city, subverting dominant narratives. Through acts of destabilizing, defragmenting, visualizing, and quiet encroachment, ordinary urban dwellers in the book create these radical transformative urban spaces every day. Spaces that break the silence on injustice, that allow for the exploration of difference, that allow for the exploration of anonymity and nonviolent urban practices. So this book really does offer something for everyone, but it's invaluable for built environment practitioners, particularly those who are looking for inspiration and yearning for really new ways of reading contemporary cities. On imagination and justice, I return again to Ursula K. Le Guin, who wrote, "We will not know our own injustice if we cannot imagine justice. We will not be free if we do not imagine freedom. We cannot demand that anyone try to attain justice and freedom who has not had a chance to imagine them as attainable." And that's what this book does. By taking seriously the everyday lives and practices of people in space and building from the ground up a new vocabulary and practice of embodied transformation, the authors allow us to reimagine the possibility of more just cities. congratulations to all the authors and to Henrietta Palmer for a wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for this really powerful introduction. And now I would like to pass on the mic to Henrietta Palmer. She's an architect and researcher at the Göteborg University and senior advisor at SLU in Sweden. Henrietta, you had a major role in orchestrating today's panel. You also had an important role in this project and in the book. Can you tell us something about that?
Thank you, Solana, and thank you, Caroline, for your kind introduction. Well, I will not speak so much about my role, but I will speak about the overall thoughts behind this book and a little bit how we have worked with it. So as Caroline said, one of the most important questions that have accompanied this work is this notion of how to imagine the urban becoming. Yes, thank you. We got a slide here coming up. And this kind of imagination, I mean, it's not a unique issue, because the image of the city of the future, this is possibly one of the most explored images in the history of architecture. And at the same time, it's one of the most overused in architectural and urban presentations. But still, this image of the becoming city is a very needed one. It is a guideline for agreements and negotiations, but it also serves as a map for citizens to position their rights and their hopes in an ever-changing urban environment. But since we know that urban transformations do not necessarily entail changes towards a more just and accessible city, but also towards a more stratified, enclosed, and segregated one, a unique question to ask is rather the one that Caroline brought forward. Who has the right to imagine an urban future, and from whose imaginations is the urban future built? So in times like these, which are marked by a high level of uncertainty, social justice is not to be taken for granted, nor is it granted that a transition towards a sustainable society will include the just city. Researchers have further pointed out that transformations we are facing imply a new language, because we cannot imagine nor build a different society without creating a vocabulary for the work that is needed. So as much as this book is about understanding the changes that citizens create, acting on urban injustice, it's also about the relationship between language and urban change. What words would it create an image of another city, and at the same time contribute to its realization? Next image, please. So 3 basic questions have guided the research behind this book. The first one is simply, what is change? How can we understand change? And to explore change processes, we have used a very simplified framework that you can see here up in this image of radical shift versus incremental changes. But then we suggest that we can integrate these 2 modes of change by introducing 4 dynamic phenomena, all of which can have a spatial impact. And these are, as Caroline already mentioned, conflicts, commons, networks, and hybridity. As concepts, they have different discursive and theoretical origins, but all, except for maybe conflicts, share the property of describing both a process of change and the result of such a process. Next image, please. The second question is, whose change? And this relates, of course, to the initial discussion about who has the right to imagine the future city. And to answer this question, we are turned to communities and organizations that for various reasons have been denied their rights where they live, or who are trying to create a new context based on their rights and needs. And these are organizations that drive transformative processes from site-specific conflicts, in turn arising from global processes such as migration, resource extraction, or human exploitation. To understand these practices, we took part of the spatial transformations they have brought about, but also of their imaginations of what kind of spaces must be created to realize a different and more just city. The third question is about space. Where does change take place? The organizations we engaged with are found on 4 different continents, but they share the common reality of being exposed to uneven geographical or urban conditions. And this is the first response to where change is taking place. The second one constitutes of the spaces created due to urban conflicts or geographical inequalities. And here we find multi-stakeholder institutional arrangements for knowledge creation or sheltering spaces for identity creation and empowerment. And what these spaces have in common is that they strive to either stage or to protect processes in which an acceptance of difference is central. Next slide, please. So our research design is based on previous experiences from 4 urban contexts or regions. And these are Södertälje in Sweden, Cape Town in South Africa, the state of Goa in India, and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And these 4 contexts were also the focus of study within the postmaster program in urban design at the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm, which provided insights into site-specific challenges as well as into local practices for urban justice. And to understand and speculate on the spatial results of these initiatives, we linked the 4 change dynamics with each one of the 4 geographical contexts. And this connection might seem arbitrary and could, of course, have been done differently, but there were also in each place certain historical, cultural, or geographical attributes that spoke for the dynamic change in question. Next slide, please. From each site then, we captured concepts that were already established by the organizations or that we in turn considered to be describing the changes taking place. These emerging concepts form the first part of a new language for the future city. The second part consists of radical imaginaries, and we have used this term to capture the underlying and expected notions that drive processes towards another reality, along with the results of such work. Sometimes we discovered that the radical imaginaries had already been shaped and built. In other cases, the radical imaginaries were proposals from this research in form of speculative claims that stemmed from the emerging concepts. Next image, please. The visual image is another component for building a language. Therefore, this work is also visual research with Katarina Nitsch as an artist and Yvan Ikhlef and Ulrika Lundgren as 2 architects who have investigated the 4 change dynamics with the visual means. Next image. On one hand, they visually describe emerging concepts and radical imaginaries on the different sites. On the other hand, and with a speculative approach, they propose new and other imaginaries. Next image, please. Finally, next image, please. Together, the emerging concepts and radical imaginaries, shaped as words or as images, growing from struggles in 4 contexts, begin to build a new language for a just city. And one last word. The struggles described have taken place against all odds. And there is something here important to learn for society facing great uncertainties. And that is that planning for uncertainty must take place in parallel with planning for spatial justice. Therefore, we conclude this work by describing the capacities and qualities of spaces that can support transformations towards a just city, and by proposing that planning should include such spaces in readiness for future uncertainties. Thank you. I now hand over to my colleagues to further present the book in more detail. But first, back to you, Sarana.
Thank you, Henrietta, for this overview of the entire book and the entire research approach. And it, of course, leaves us eager to find out more and more details about each of the case studies. But before that, we see what a complex research structure the language of the becoming city has. So I would like to ask Iain Low, architect and professor emeritus at the University of Cape Town, to slowly... Yes, you hear me? To tell us a bit of about the research structure. So Iain looks back at a broad experience in research spatial justice, urban transformation, and equity. Can you please tell a few words about the research structure of the book and of the project?
I'm just going to give a very brief background into the configuration of the research project. And it was sort of an exercise in how to structure co-production within a global research project. And the primary thing that, in fact, Henrietta's also already articulated, there were very clear preconditions for this work. And we built upon work that had been established over 10 years of a program, a professional postmasters that Henrietta ran. And that really surfaced this kind of idea about topical thinking about the future, but not through meta-narratives, through very situated constructs that were grounded and relied on people being there in place. So that contributed towards our model of contextuality and relationality in the work, to surface kind of things that are locally specific, but translate into global relevance. The 4 topics have already been mentioned, and I would say that in the spirit of activism, these became verbs. They very much became about networking, commoning, and hybridizing. All of them being globally applicable, but each of the issues, in fact, could have been situated everywhere. So it really speaks to the translatability or the transferability of these kind of universal topics that can then be applied specifically in their own context. The group had, I think, a very interesting diversity. Individuals in a collective from multiple disciplines. What I think we were characterized by would be a term called academic activists. So we really were engaged in grounded work and engaging communities, and that was sort of a pre-commons. But also what's interesting is there's a difference in age, in culture, discipline, personality. And I'd also say that we all came with a collective consciousness that was built by our own context, through our own colleagues. So that brought a richness to this project. But a theoretical specificity and a collective consciousness was really what grounded then the work of co-production in bringing the research language or practice together. So the primary means through which we operated was through in loco workshops where we each visited each other's country or city, and we'd done previous research. There'd been established readings and theoretical commons for it. But the person responsible organized a rich set of interactions with interlocutors that were local, with sites and communities, and established sort of a broadening of the idea in context. These happened over 6-month periods. Obviously, it did get extended a bit, but it's really like a 2-year project that got extended in the end with the writing. Coming from so many different backgrounds, what was really interesting was the horizontality that existed within the group. And I call it a kind of a horizon of interconnectivity within which each individual got a turn to rise and to run or contribute in their own way through the shared sort of similar value base that we had. And in a sense, that sort of approximates the idea of many of the aspects in our in the project that we're looking at. So for me, it was an incredibly enriching experience, and really, I think, an interesting model for the contemporary, post-pandemic condition of how we begin to collaborate and learn from each other across multiple relationalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Great learnings, and also very much looking forward to the conversation afterwards to find out more. As we said, the book identifies 4 change dynamics that emerged on 4 different continents. These are, to recap, conflicts, networks, commons, and hybridity. Were all mentioned by Henrietta before. So 4 terms for urban contexts and 4 different continents. I invite you to start a journey around the world and zoom into these 4 instances and see what these change dynamics each stand for and how they contribute to the formulation of the language of the becoming city. And for that, I will ask Katarina, Solano, Mariana, and Iain, together with Salma, to present their own case studies. After that, Yvan Ikhlef and Ulrika Lundgren, both architects from Sweden, will join us in the conversation. So please allow me to start with Katarina Nitsch. She's a visual artist from Sweden who works with different mediums like video, drawings, and paintings. The drawings from the book are hers, that much I can reveal. But not only that, she was involved in a particular project with the Syrian community in Södertälje, which is an arrival city in Sweden. And she will tell us more about the changed dynamics of conflict that led to emerging concepts. Katarina?
Thank you. Can you hear me well? I hope so. Okay, so as you already mentioned, Södertälje is an arrival city of around 100 inhabitants, about 40 kilometers southwest of Stockholm. Next slide, please. During the 60s and early 70s, a housing construction program was implemented across Sweden, with suburban additions being made to almost every Swedish city. And in today's Södertälje, these neighborhoods that you can see on the images are largely inhabited by people with personal or family experience of migration. And a significant feature of Swedish urban development during the second half of the 19th century is the impact of popular movements and associations. The Swedish branch of the workers' movement contributed greatly to the establishment of public institutions. These include the meeting halls like Folkets Hus, People's House, and the independent church movement. It built spaces for religious congregations, especially in small towns and in the countryside. And I mention this because it's important to understand, answer to the questions of what is needed for productive dynamics of change to take place, what is needed architectonically, and what is needed on an individual level, and what preconditions does the city offer, this specific city offer. Next slide, please. So to understand conflicts within the urban space as productive dynamics of change, we approached Södertälje through the Swedish Assyrian community that today constitute approximately 1/3 of the inhabitants of Södertälje. And we were accompanied by Marlene Skander, a Swedish Assyrian social anthropologist who at the time of our research was working at Södertälje City Hall. And we were introduced to sites organized in response to conflicts or to meet needs stemming from conflict situations. Next slide, please. It is within these at once concrete and abstract relationships that the Assyrian community engages with conflicts and has established spaces in the Södertälje urban context. I will not go through them all, but these are the dynamics of conflict that we worked on a little bit, some of them. You can read more about them in the book. Next slide, please. So again, what is needed for productive dynamics of change to take place? What preconditions does the city offer? I already mentioned the Swedish workers' movement that during the second half of the 19th century contributed to the establishment of public institutions. And migrants arriving in Södertälje and other cities in Sweden as well soon adapted to this tradition of organization encouraged by the state to support their own ethnic associations. And following the tradition of the popular movements, these associations constructed their own physical spaces for gathering, worship, leisure, sport, communication, education, and so on. Influenced by the societal debates, norm, and development in Sweden, a conflict built up between an older, more conservative group of the community who were more traditionally religious and more patriarchal, and a transformative younger group who were more secular and later even more feminist oriented. And the conflict within the Assyrian community eventually led up to 2 churches being built. only about 2 kilometers from each other into neighboring suburbs of Södertälje. And with the two churches as centers for the now separate communities, civic and cultural amenities were further established. At both sites, large wedding halls, an important feature of a religious, social, and cultural practice, were set up next to the cathedrals. And within a span of only 2 kilometers, two large complexes of parallel civil, cultural, and religious activities had emerged, serving the practices of the now two communities. Next slide, please. The Cultural House of the Assyrian Association has meeting spaces that are used by different groups within the community. A recent initiative is the project The Country of Reading. And this project has the goal to capture the most recently arrived migrant children and give them early access to Swedish language. The Cultural House also includes the offices of the Syrian Federation of Sweden, together with research spaces, library, and so on. The Country of Reading ultimately established itself as a contact zone through the destabilizing capacity of a persona that we have chosen to call the destabilizer. Translated into an urban social context, this could be understood as a capacity to anticipate and repair, or maybe rather rebuild, situations where conflicts can emerge due to differing values and norms. Next slide, please. The destabilizer has a certain societal position that gives her the agency to act. This could be an intersectional position, such as that of an engaged professional, activist, parent, and community member, or an in-between position moving across organizational or cultural borders. As a boundary spanner, the destabilizer is able to question cultural stagnation, oppression, or other obsolete values from within, at the same time as she uncovers and identifies structural gaps in society. Excuse me. She furthermore has a multiple perspective on conflict. She anticipates new, concrete, relevant, and long-lasting solutions for high urgency situations for the purpose of effecting profound societal change. The destabilizer makes conventions unstable through practical action. Rather than empowering only one particular community, she forms a new one based on transversal ethical practices. And in the context of the language of the becoming city, the destabilizer has the capacity to forge new relations with space and thereby to create and recreate spaces for the negotiations of differences. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katarina. I would like to share with all of you some voices from the audience. Asa Anderson is congratulating, saying that to see the project coming together in this publication is, a source of joy, and congratulates from the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm. And Edgar Peterse is also saying that, referring to the book, how beautifully crafted it is, with enormous care, reflecting the mindful theoretical and methodological approach. Both congratulate you, and I just wanted to share this with everyone because I think the book and the project definitely deserve this praise. And now I would like to move further to Goa and give the stage to Solano da Silva, who studied and who teaches developmental studies and political theory. He will tell us something more about the polycentered network in Goa, discussing the change dynamics of networks.
Thank you, Sorana. So, a brief background. Goa is the smallest state in India, but the most urban state, with 62% of its residents living in urban spaces compared to India's 32%. Now, networks which were investigated at this site refers to transforming and open-ended mesh of interactions through various elements. And these elements are largely the built environment, urban and rural systems, social bonds, practices, and ecological systems, all coming together into the form of a mesh. Can we go to the next slide, please? So every urban space can be understood as a unique structuration of this meshing. Its possibility to use this, deploy this to understand any urban space. An essential feature of networks is that they are adjustable and open-ended. Since networks by nature transform, they can move towards a condition of sustainability, care, and balance, which is arguably desirable, or we can move towards conditions of unsustainability, exploitation, and ultimate disruption, often itself the result of them coming into under the influence of networks of power and control, which are understood as disadvantageous. Could we go to the next slide, please? So this work encourages us to first read the various network configurations in an urban site. This often means extending beyond a narrow definition and delineation of what is considered the urban. It then encourages us to recognize the various outcomes of network configurations and then assess whether these outcomes are desirable or problematic. And finally, this work asks us to recognize that in order to return to or maintain sustainability or balance, one requires direct counteraction, or what has been referred to as critical networking. These can be understood as practices of network transformation at both micro and macro scales. And here are some of the emergent concepts. Could we go to the next slide, please? The first that we have here is of completing links, location within a spatial network. Here we have illustrations by Ulrika that acknowledges the locus of an agent within a network, using two case studies, that of Tiracol and the sex workers in Baina, and the through the Tenants Association and Swiftwash, respectively. It explains how processes of fragmentation are key to understand how you have predatory international capital coming in and alienating agricultural land, in the case of Tiracol, and perpetuating vulnerability and exploitation of sex workers in Baina. Further, this work then intervenes and says that it's like a tenants association in Tiracol and Swiftwash in working with sex workers in Baina relocate agents within new configurations, which result in resistance, rehabilitation, and reorientation. Could we go to the next slide, please? Here we have another emergent concept on defragmentation via investigation of water systems in Goa. These are illustrations by Yvan, and it foregrounds the primacy of the water cycle for any inhabitation. This imaginary examines the west-east movement of the monsoons that bring rain to the state, and subsequently the east-west drainage of river systems back into the sea, and calls for this to replace our imagination of a arbitrary political sort of unit of planning to use the water system as a basis for investigating a new urban imagination. Could we go to the next slide, please? In this emergent concept, which refers to spinning bridges, we have a perspective that bridges as infrastructure systems tend to disregard ecological and agricultural spaces. But this is a very daring concept. This concept of spinning bridges dares to see a bridge as a node rather than a link within a network. Bridges would be seen as links, but this goes against that intuition and says, could we imagine bridges as nodes? So performing dual functions of both gathering as well as spreading capacities that are desirable and that we value. Could we go to the next slide, please? Another concept, acting out of love for land, emerged from investigations of the Goenchamathi Permanent Fund, which is trying to reimagine how iron ore mining is done in the state, and is arguing for a universal basic income, and that this proposal then says should be connected to the allocation of this universal basic income to every woman in every household, because this would provide for a more equitable negotiation when prioritizing common investments, such as investments in education and water security. Next slide, please. Breaking silence. This is research. This emerges through research carried out by Katarina, who we just heard, and Evelyn Fernandes, and looks closely at the implications of that migration has had as Goa has become more and more rapidly urban. They have interviewed 6 migrant women from 6 different villages, all of which depict narratives of familial abuse and loss alongside wider social discrimination, and how they have, through this, built a life for themselves. Katarina and Evelyn find that women interviewed suggest that their native or home territories ought to become sites of potential intervention and inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Solano. Please allow me to pass the mic to Mariana Cavalcanchi. She's currently an associate professor in the sociology department at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. Her research centers on issues related to housing infrastructure, urbanism, and public policy. Mariana has a deep understanding of the informal communities in Rio and will tell us more about how the change dynamics of hybridity influences sites of new knowledge production. Welcome, Mariana.
Thank you very much, Sarana. So good to be here with all of you. It's a pleasure to bring this to this kind of conclusion where we have such an exciting launch with people from 4 continents, and that we get to actually relive in a way, of course, the process of constructing this book. So my job here is sort of to bring you from the networks of Goa to the hybridities of Rio. And I think one of the crucial aspects of this is the aspect of urban time, right? Of temporality, and how long these communities have been perceived and have perceived themselves as part of the city, right? And I think in Rio we have a deeper history of this, because the communities that we visited, one thing was that we chose to visit communities that weren't exactly the archetypical favelas of the South Zone, where you have those beautiful views and very exotic depictions of urban inequality, but we actually chose to look into Rio's urban peripheries, where Rio looks like basically any other city with that's surrounded by a very poor periphery. And out in these 3 places, we did this whole process took place in a very particular present. I think we're talking here about urban futures. And I think one aspect of this that's really important to bear in mind is that these urban futures, they are so powerful precisely because they're in the imagination, and because they are the futures of particular presence. So I think it's worth saying something of about the particular present in which we were in Rio. Can you please move to the next slide, Yvan, please? So we're in 2017, Rio de Janeiro, 1 year after the Olympics, right, that themselves had imprinted a particular temporality in the daily life of the city for over a decade, you know, with this very tight deadline and so many huge infrastructural projects and programs, and largely unfinished big, massive projects, right? Can you move on to the next one, please, Yvan? One of the most famous is the Teleférico in Alemão, which is this gondola cable car system that was deactivated just 1 month after the Olympics. So when we were visiting in in Alemão, it had already turned into this white elephant, into this ruining structure for over a year that nobody knew what to do with it. Well, not really nobody, because the people that we met in Raízes em Movimento, they had many plans for this, and they had many plans for many urban futures. And I think that is one of the things that we really captured there, how really what matters about these urban futures is their effect upon the present and the agency that they give to these subjects, that they lend to these subjects, that people can actually think through and try to make and build a better city, right? Can you move on to the next one, please? Oh yeah, this is sort of what I wanted to look into, right? How each present imagines its own futures, and what really matters is what this does to the present, more than holding on to this fixed image of a desired future, right? Can you please move on one more, please? Thank you. So yeah, this is about the location. This is an image about this location that is usually a highly invisible area of the city, where it turns to not to the ocean, but to Guanabara Bay, where there are huge pollution issues and issues related to global warming and coming up, and issues related particularly to waste management and the relationship to waters in this area. So, from looking at Rio's urban futures in that particular present, in these specific sites, it showed us precisely this power of this virtual future upon the present. And I can say that in terms of all our sites. Can you please move to the next one, please? The first one, oh yeah, this is the bay that I was mentioning. Next one more, please. And this is Maré, which is a favela complex that dates back to the 1940s, and they've had very little help from the state. And despite that, in the 10 years before our visit, they had already accomplished their own census map and museum. So these are citizens that are really concerned about building collective life, and not only that, about building collective data. The same can be said about can you move on to the next one, please, Yvan? About the Faculdade de Educação, the education university of the Baixada Fluminense, which are the lowlands in Rio's urban periphery, where this building built by, that's part of the public schools built in the 1980s, designed by Oscar Niemeyer, have been subsequently reappropriated in this attempt to build a better future as seen from the urban periphery. And finally, the next one, please. And finally, Raízes em Movimento, located in the Complexo do Alemão, just under the abandoned gondola cable car system, where researchers from all over the world and from all over Rio get to meet to discuss new research methodologies that center on circulation. So what we see in all these sites is really a blurring of the boundaries through which we usually think through space and politics. So the boundaries between public and private, and the boundaries between the state and civil society are in constant negotiation here in this attempt to build and imagine better futures. And all of this really, after we left, right, 1 year after that, Bolsonaro came into power, and so the daily conditions in which all these organizations worked were deeply transformed. And what we saw was precisely how the accumulated knowledge through their daily practices actually made these communities feel that there was a presence of some sort of state, even though the state was not there once the pandemic came along. So these organizations, they basically organized the distribution of aid, they got families information, they basically did everything that the state under Bolsonaro no longer does, or does not even aspire to anymore. So these subjects, through the daily construction of futures that themselves change, they come to show us how the power of the imagination actually is something that can deeply transform daily life, even when conditions, structural conditions and political conditions and national conditions are so adverse as they have been here ever since 2018 when Bolsonaro took power and we had to face a pandemic. So I just wanted to note that I'm really happy that we actually did this research during that time, because I think it really brings to the fore all these highly invisible processes that are so crucial to understand and now are present, and the ways that we can imagine our futures right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariana, also for putting this specific case study into this specific context in time, which is highly interesting. We will be talking about it further in the conversation. But now we have arrived to the fourth case study happening in Cape Town in South Africa, the change dynamics of commons that Iain Low, we've already met you, Iain, and Salma Ismail will talk about. Let me briefly introduce Salma. She's an emeritus associate professor at the School of Education at the University of Cape Town. She does research in adult education theory and pedagogic theory, with a focus on learning in development contexts and social movements. So both Iain and Salma can tell us more about the conflict between informal and formal communities in Cape Town, and about their contribution to this transdisciplinary group endeavor in form of the Commons.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I have, yeah, thanks for the first slide. So Cape Town is an apartheid city. Next slide, please. Its legacy is etched in a spatiality of racial segregation and the genocide of indigenous cultural practices. Colonial apartheid legislation and its unique topography have allied in maintaining this disenfranchised landscape. Almost 30 years after the advent of democracy, this spatiality persists. Next slide, please. Social justice and spatial equity have therefore become the primary task for built environment practitioners to confront and in their attempts to transform the city. Next, please. And commoning has emerged as a local response to this quest for transformation. It represents a change dynamic arising from unique alliances between the agency of individuals and the production of new collective institutional formations, wherein a radical imagination recenters people ahead of architectural space and fosters the rebuilding of community as a precondition for the resilience required to sustain change. This might be termed the decolonial turn, predominantly evaded by the profession or the formal architecture. So the projects, I'm going to just look at two in depth, all happen within the Cape Flats, which is in that predominant orange area to the right of the city. And the ones I'm going to really look at is where conflict is seen through violence, and particularly against women in very fragile emerging settlements. The whole of this area has, in the last 30 years, become filled through rapid migration, which has caused incredible urban settlements to expand. So each of these projects have got really an interesting way in which they configured, and that's why they were selected, because of the agency of the sponsoring agent and the instrumentation that's established within the communities in order for them to sustain themselves afterwards, and predominantly through the act of commoning. Can I have the next slide, please? The first project is the violence protection through urban upgrade in Harare, Khayelitsha. And this project has offered a unique instrument whereby co-production has been effected between the community and the state with the assistance of a donor organization, and implemented through a separate leadership agency or quasi-NGO organization as the negotiating mediator or the enabler of the project. Prior to any intervention, violence protection through urban upgrades follows a methodology of community empowerment through active engagement to identify the critical issues requiring address through socio-spatial intervention. The public realm and the building of civic or social capacity for self-determination and the concomitant self-reliance that supports civil society and community life are its ultimate goals, with the building of architecture being the support or the backdrop. The Mtongeni, which you can see in the right-hand slide, and you see the images and the kind of identifier of Katarina there about the body that is, suspect to incredible violence, through the absence of infrastructure and the reliance of individual settlement, means that it becomes more vulnerable. So the establishment of the Mtongeni, which is just one trope that is built into this project, it's a isiXhosa word for water source, and it's a local response to infrastructural need whilst dealing with cultural local socialization. As a collective node for accessing water and sanitation, washing, children's playing and learning, and other social efforts, it represents a non-bounded space of connectivity within the complexity of a self-built informal settlement. Often, these places were installed by rote that endangered life previously. So here, health, safety, security, connectivity, education, socialization, all are condensed within a unique single neighborhood-based cultural infrastructure, affording an organic, locally grounded response to the predominant absence of a public realm that we find in informal settlements. In other areas besides the informal settlement, a set of active boxes, sports facilities, vegetable gardens, and amenities have been introduced to offer higher order, locally identified and self-managed interventions. In each of this, community has been constructed to the bonds of co-production and collaborative ownership over these individual projects. Can I go to the next slide, please? The next project is the Victoria Mxenge settlement, a bit close to the center of Cape Town, and it arises from the desire of a group of women to assume responsibility for their own shelter. Enabled by Salma Ismail and Sean Cuff, the methodology fell within the STI Shakwela International Model and enabled women, their empowerment through the acquisition of skill in finances, in building and technology, in management, and later to be elevated into becoming active participants in assisting and aiding other people within their area. Together with the state subsidy, the women's own willingness to self-build meant gaining double the government subsidized unit. So the people's housing process, which is what this is named as, literally enables the potential of building of communal bonds through the act of shelter building, and reinforces the individual or beyond the individual belonging whilst initiating collective action within a new meeting place. The space at the bottom in the left-hand picture is the space that has been organized for that community to work together, engage the community with. Next slide, please. So commoning is a complex process characterized by complexity and contradictions, those which often threaten the life of the project. So the role of professionals is necessarily that of enabler and support of capacitation and human bonding for community to be built and sustained going forward. Often tasks must be iterated and repeated through a spiraled learning process. And the successful communing, a group becomes empowered to engage the broader world in consulting on this task or what they've acquired and leveraging their newly acquired collective agency for gain. So these diagrams contest, these are by Yvan, and they contest the sort of sequential development that's common to most planning and architectural method, and introduce this kind of iterative moving forward through reverting all the time, depending on then what the new reconfigured relationalities are by the context that one is working within. Next slide, please. So, in concluding, language is a preconditioner for change. It has to be predicated on affording new relationalities between people of difference, and it infers an altered spatiality, especially where conflict pre-exists. Putting people before space means human capital before financial capital. So the primary medium here has been predicated on the rebuilding of communities and doing it through something that doesn't segregate it into siloed things, but sees cultural practices and infrastructures as being codependent in order to engage people and ensure their longevity. Essentially, there's no best practice. There's a production of locality through highly situated practices that are specific to a very particular time and place and community. So ownership and belonging become instilled through this process. The procedures through co-production, and as I mentioned earlier, this notion of a horizon of interconnectivities means that there's an equivalent in the value of every participant or group participant. And that's where the agency of the external negotiator becomes critical. So in the end, it really boils down for commoning to leadership and governance and the relationship between the agency of the individual and the evolution of some kind of instrumentation that allows for that to proceed after the project has been concluded. So the empowerment of people, the ability for self-reliance, citizen and civil society become the longer term outcome. What's critical in this, at this particular junction in South Africa, is that it will support new forms of governance that lead to civil society, particularly in the increasing and projected failure of the state, and the necessity for people to rely on their own relationality and their own context to make their own way forward in the world. So commoning will become more common in the redevelopment, particularly as a trope for the rapid urbanization that's going to happen in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Iain. Salma?
Hello, everybody. I want to thank Iain and Henrietta for inviting me to the book launch. Can you go to the next slide, please? And to say that the book came as a wonderful surprise, and it's such a testament to working across disciplines. It is both an intellectual and creative gift to honor the research. Then also to thank the creative team who so beautifully showed what is possible when disciplines interface with each other. Next slide, please. The book really illustrates so clearly the necessity of transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary research that's border crossing are rich and promising. And I'm coming from adult education, and in adult education, you know, we are always crossing borders because we are teaching adults in multiple contexts, and context is very important. So it is important to recognize knowledge in all its diversity. For here in this book, we can both read, see, and feel the knowledge of the commons, and which can be included into the academy to transform reality and work towards social justice. I worked in Victorian Mxenge for many, many years, and the representation of the VM in this book through poetry, visual media, and scientific language shows that the language of the city is not bounded and includes the historical, social, and cultural lives of people. The book is an example of how education can reclaim subjectivity and to explore which is not visible, the emotional, the sentimental, the intuitive, with an emphasis on how truths are negotiated to tell a whole or multiple stories. Next slide, please. I do wish to illustrate with a small vignette to follow on from Mariana how the pandemic has changed context and has also is also in constant need of protection. Just to illustrate, on the weekend of Freedom Day in April 2020, this was during the pandemic, a battle over electricity turned violent after women from VM tried to stop illegal electricity connections being made by people from nearby Ramaphosa informal settlement. Separated from VM is Ramaphosa by a narrow servitude road. It is fringed by piles of garbage. Ramaphosa came into being about 2 years ago. The settlement is on marginal land unsuitable for development purpose and has been growing ever since. It is a mosaic of zinc sheets and wood, plywood and corrugated iron, and its occupants live without basic services, no water, no roads, inadequate sanitation, and no electricity. And when VM look across the road at Ramaphosa, they see their past there. And when Ramaphosa look at VM, they see their future there. So it is these two different states of societies, commons looking at each other. Next slide, please. So just to say that the commons can be tenuous if resources are scarce. The youth in Ramaphosa settlement began to vandalize the formal houses in VM. And during the pandemic, and everybody at home, there was a surge in demand for electricity. And the Ramaphosa youth tapped into the electricity boxes in VM. When requests were made for intermediation by the local councillor, it proved fruitless. So the VM women took agency into their own hands and disconnected the illegal wiring themselves. The Ramaphosa youth responded by laying siege to the VM community. There were incidences of stone throwing, and the fire bombing of electricity boxes followed. The VM responded by holding community meetings, and this is where their strong struggle of building a community really came to the fore. They held meetings, nighttime vigils, and patrols to protect their community and houses. Eventually, they sent one police van to barricade the entrance, and some arrests were made. So these women were now in their 60s, would not have to gather in groups and stay awake all night to protect the homes they built with their own sweat and blood. I'm just going to ask Yvan to go through the slides to give you some visual images of what happened. So that's an electric box that got bombed by Ramaphosa. Here you see the VM people holding community meetings in the COVID period. Next slide, please. Another slide of community meetings, which were ongoing for many days and nights. Next slide, please. There's the lone police van to protect the community. Next slide, please. And these are a picture of the VM women in their 60s who sit up all night to protect their homes and their community. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to reflect on this vignette to say that on reflection, what the VM women story tells us about the future work on commons is that we do need to take cognizance of the inequities post-production and in COVID times to sustain stressed and poor communities. And this requires an ongoing responsibility and commitment from the Academy to rebuild structures from the ground up. In thinking about the future vision for the commons, you do need solidarity action to raise consciousness, which brings together the urban and the informal against commodification, and to hold the state accountable to the promise of housing for all. Thank you again. It's really a truly wonderful book.
Thank you, Salma, for your contribution now, and also thank you, Iain and Mariana, Solano, and Katarina for all giving us so many and interesting insights on the core topics of the book. So we've been talking about the book. The book is like the main trigger of today's presentation. And it's a book that we've seen invites us into the realm of imagination, as Caroline said, but also confronts us with some very real situations through these case studies. It recollects like a lot of your research findings. So yes, of course, it gathers and depicts the work of this transdisciplinary group, but at the same time, I would like to see it as a call for action, this book. So this actually opens, the window to the future that, or an ideal future that this book might offer, or it's an incentive to do something. Maybe, Henrietta, coming back to you, what do you expect this book to trigger? And who is addressed by this call for action? Who should act, and in what direction?
Well, thank you, Sorana, and thank you everybody for your presentations. I mean, we already see the ones who are acting here, and as I said, acting in spite of being exposed to great uncertainty. That's part of their everyday life. So my proposal for action here is for the ones who are in more comfortable situations, to take a look at this type of work, to these communities, how they organize, what kind of language they use, how they integrate with knowledge, how they create protective spaces for empowerment, and to see how that can be established across society. So it's not like something that happens only because you have you're out of access to other means, but something that actually could be introduced by society at large. Also, as I said in the beginning, to make society more resilient, because what we've seen now during COVID times is the unresilience of society, how little we were prepared, even as we see society like Sweden were so effectively organized that our resources were already taken away, etc. I mean, that there were no supplies, no storage, I mean, nothing of that kind. So that kind of readiness, that kind of preparation, that kind of imagination that you can find in these communities, I think, is something for society at large to deploy.
And who are then the actors of change? Because you've, or Iain at least, defined you as academic activists. I don't know up to what point you're the ones perpetuating this work, or it has to pass on to other communities, to other layers in the society. I don't know who wants to say something about it. Maybe Mariana?
Thank you, Sorana. I think that one of the things that we learn from this is that there really are different positionalities, right? That this language, this future, this imagination of the future, that it really depends on this diversity of people and trajectories, and that, each person that makes up these networks actually brings a different perspective and a different way of framing these urban futures. And I really think it's in the collective reworking of these different trajectories that we find something new, right? That incremental change comes along, and eventually more radical transformations.
Thank you, Mariana. Despite the fact that I very much support this approach that you put forward here, I would like to play the devil's advocate today. And question a little bit this aspiration that may have like a touch of utopian thinking in it, to have like to create a universal language, because we all know a language is something that is strongly embedded in a culture and has a high degree of specificity. So maybe I would like to invite Yvan and Ulrika to the conversation as well, because we haven't talked to them today, and really pose this question, up to what extent is this a realistic endeavor, and then how should it be materialized to create a universal language for a new, different urban future?
Yeah, did you hear me? No, but universal is maybe not the right term, I would say. We were very aware of the fact that this is almost an impossible task to just come to imagine giving any images for a possible becoming language for the city. It was already a very challenging task. So I would say we had a little bit more modest attitude, and much of this is already a challenge. Like we can hear today, it's very nice to hear you all again, but it's very different voices, and within the research team, it's already a challenge to find, let's say, a common voice of all those voices. And in a way, it does strike me today, listening back to what we have been doing, that we have been developing a kind of new concept and new words that actually talk to us. Actually, it's about us. The destabilizer, let's say, threshold. We have a lot of different concepts. All of those, they are talking about the way we have been working in this team together. And let's say that it's already enough trying to find a place where you can mix all those voices and figure out if there is one possible single language of us together. Let's say that would be big enough for me instead of talking about universality.
Ulrika, would you like to maybe say something, or should we move on to further questions? Okay, yes, Ulrika just said that she's unable to say something at this point, but then let me maybe elaborate on that. Thank you very much, Yvan. It's quite revealing what you've said. We've heard about your specific case studies, I want to call them, and I understand them as a compound of, let's say, physical, social, geographical, political, cultural, historical ingredients that all come together and are highly specific in the end. So I am interested more from, let's say, a methodological point of view. How did you manage to abstract and derive these specific aspects into what might become more generic learnings that can be applied in other situations as well? I don't know, maybe Iain would like to say something about that.
So, I mean, one of the issues within the academy and transformation is the nature of the curriculum and the pedagogy. And the projects that I presented are very marginal. They're not mainstream. And in terms of moving forward, one needs to build this more into the kind of academy. So the role of education, the role of in-situ engagement, the kind of presenting of a new language, or like embedding this within the teaching of every day means that we get a new situatedness. The prospect today is that each person can express themselves rather than following typologies or rote, which is driven by, the practices that the state and the profession provoke. So there are two things. One is the relation of the self and the other. And I think that, Fanon, in Counter to Violence, speaks about radical humanity, and that requires empathy for the other. And for me, that's one of the primary things that comes out of the commoning is, recentering the human, recentering people, and then that means decentering yourself as the primary agent. And these are very limited things. I mean, for me, it's surprising that VM and VPUU are not being, sponsored and directed by everyone, that they aren't like clear examples. The other side that I would say in moving on is the necessity of spatial literacy. In architectural education, foundational knowledge, and I think it's across many disciplines, has been supplanted by people sort of responding in whatever way. And if you want a new language, or what Henrietta has described as the language of the becoming city, it's something that's emerging, then you need to have a cadre of people who are actively engaged in that. And that requires, in the sense I spoke about the way Henrietta prepared the ground for this studio by 10 years of engagement globally in situated practices, empowering people through a quite deliberate sort of process. So we need more of those. I mean, Bell Hooks's notion of marginality really comes to mind. Rather than working at the center, how do we find a pedagogy of marginality? And that means decentering the subject of all those who've occupied hierarchical hegemony positions. So I don't know if that offers any insight, but that's my response.
Yeah, Iain, thank you. It's very revealing, and I would like to mention one question that has come from the audience, quite interesting. An architecture student based in Cape Town and member of civil society asks, how can one contribute to these causes? Maybe I direct the question to Iain, but also to Henrietta, who has been has had this pivotal role in orchestrating this research group.
So I'll just briefly say, one of the prospects when you graduate is that one is immediately attracted to these neoliberal practices, and there's not a lot of alternatives, but there are some. So VPU is one, but in Cape Town, there's a group called Development Action Group. These are all institutions that were set up under apartheid to do the work of the state, and they've sustained themselves. So in your year out, that's where you go and ground yourself. You have to go and seek other avenues to find those imaginations. In other parts of the world, there's plenty of that. When I graduated, I left South Africa and I lived in Lesotho for 10 years. And that was actually my second degree, which was very interdisciplinary. It taught me about a different culture. You have to move your body. It's not going to come to you and it's not immediately there. It requires research and work, and there definitely are possibilities out there. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if I should follow up on that, but I think, we're talking here a little bit about transdisciplinarity, but there is clearly a need in society to engage with very, very complex issues and to bring different kind of knowledges together. And I think in all the situations where you either see that knowledge needs to be integrated or brought together to overcome something or to deal with a complex matter, there is also a space needed for that purpose. So I think as an architect student or somebody who wants to engage spatially, I think to look for these situations in society where there is and that could often take the starting point within the conflict, but also when people come together to overcome complexities or injustices that they are facing, there is often a need for a space that can support and that can be a resource for that type of knowledge integration needed. So I think that's also something to look for and to go there.
So I understand you both encourage like the self-initiative and interested people really going out and looking for these opportunities. Thank you. So maybe moving further to another question. Repeated term throughout your presentations was conflicts. Not only in Katarina's presentation that specifically looked into the change dynamics of conflicts, but also throughout all of your contributions. It is a difficult term because it can be charged with a negative meaning, but I do assume and know that conflicts also are presented here as, impulses that trigger change. Can you maybe say something about it, about all the positive influence of conflicts? Maybe Katarina or Solano can say something about it. Katarina, would you like to say something?
I thought Solano should speak, as I've been speaking about it.
Sure.
Solano, go.
The other expert in this. Katarina, you go ahead, please.
Okay, I just want to say something very briefly about that, and that's that. I mean, a democratic society is based on conflicts, I would say. So it's more a matter of finding ways to negotiate and not for those situations to turn into a war. So I think that's really the basis of this. I mean, any country or any society community that wants to develop needs conflicts in order to do so. So that's my brief answer to that. Solano, please go ahead.
No, on the same lines, this initiative to do this research would not itself have emerged without this. It's very interesting that this is the first change dynamic that we look at, and then we flow to the others like networks and commons and hybridity. But they begin from this, a state that is in tension, a state of affairs in tension that prompt us to then imagine an alternative or a way at least of managing these conflicts. So yes, thank you.
Iain, would you like to follow up on that?
Sure, thank you. So I support Katarina. I mean, conflict resolution is really the history of cities. And democracy is really finding a way in which difference can coexist. So, one of the unique things about us as human beings, we think, we reflect, we understand, and then we modify our behavior. We are able to modify our behavior. So, if we want to resolve conflict, we have to, and that's where I think commoning is good, is to start sharing alternative value bases or seeing the benefit of another set of parameters through education or through, for myself speaking again from commoning, is that those values are taught within the process of commoning where the project is evolved. And I think that Salma spoke very well into that, where women that are probably originally very uneducated made very educated choices in the face of conflict and violence. So I think we have to understand it's quite critical that Henrietta started with conflict. That conflict is the basis from which we then engage the world through our differences. Otherwise, you wouldn't resolve and get these diversities of things. So that's also, instead of the hierarchical, not binary project, we're dealing with this thing of creation of difference and diversity is where that becomes some kind of coactive condition. And so for me, the question is, what is our agency and what are the new instruments? What are the outcomes? So I mentioned Development Action Group earlier, which came out of apartheid struggle. It's a professional service organization set up to do the work of the state in its failure. It still has unbelievable relevance today. So, you know, that's our role, is to create new organizations, I think. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Iain. Maybe moving forward to yet another question. I realize you strongly put in contrast neoliberal planning practices with elements from this new vocabulary of urban engagement and let's say alternative approaches. But it's not a question of either or, right? It's not either we go that way or the other way. Both practices is reasonable to think like that, would have to coexist. How should they negotiate between each other? Henrietta, maybe?
Maybe I direct that question to Mariana. I think that's something that you've been looking into specifically.
No, I was sort of hoping that you would have the last word here, so I'm gonna, in a way, throw it back to you. I think that this whole thing with the conflicts and I think that one of the things that really worked out here was how, you know, we had one lens to look at each of the cities, and that sort of cleared up all the other regions, right? And all the other practices that we were looking at. So in a way, I think it was very interesting also that we began in the global north, right? And that we were looking at these issues from there, and that then we came and went, and that all these dynamics actually got us to rethink all of these sites. So something really new came out of this co-authorship here. But I'd like Henrietta to have the last word here, because I really think that it's, you know, you were the one who brought us all together, and I think there was something so perceptive about all this that would be really interesting for us to hear from you. You know, how you look at the end result of all of this and all the process and where all this goes to, right? Because we're talking about the becoming city. So where do you think this goes?
Well, I wish I knew where it's going, but I think, I mean, I remember reading Susan Feinstein, and where she defines the word that cities tie up to as competition. That's the word to which all cities kind of align, that we need to compete with each other, we need to make innovations that can compete with each other and so on. And I think that's so enmeshed in the way we think about cities today. So we don't think that there are other, it cannot be differently. And as Yvan said, this language might not be universal, but still I think there were quite clear that when we were looking through these four concepts, we could, and four contexts, and even looking through these different dynamics, we could see that there were similar engagements and similar vocabularies that emerged. So I thought that there was something clearly coming through that had at least a component on similarity. I mean, and this whole idea of like, for example, defragmenting, trying to bring things together again. I mean, and that's that work of actually bringing together what is constantly being broken apart. I mean, I think that's a major endeavor that we have to engage with as an example. To think about cities as that we need to bring together rather than to constantly renew, constantly have this violent act upon our environment that we have to tear apart to bring something new, instead of just bringing things together again, defragment. So I think, and I mean, I hope that just trying to think along these lines, maybe there could be some kind of mental shift. Maybe that's too much to ask for, but at least some kind of other thinking, that we can think about cities, we can think about space differently than engage with this. normal words of competition and bringing the new forward constantly, and that the new actually can be something else. So I don't know if that was a good way to end this conversation, but maybe it is time to end, because I think we are running over time now, Sorana, aren't we?
Thank you, Henrietta. Yes, I mean, I do have a lot more questions. One other question from the audience was where the book can be purchased. Well, the answer is either on the website or in your favorite bookstore. It's available throughout the world and can be ordered and purchased also online. So I did put the link here. It's also in the invitation, the flyer that Henrietta sent out. I think it's easy to get it. So this was a final word from Henrietta. I think it was a wonderful ending for this great conversation. It was a very convincing journey throughout the world, where you showed us these very specific situation case studies that you've worked with, and what you have elaborated from that and derived from that. You use them as like litmus tests that can then be translated into real actions. And I really invite everyone to be aware of that and read this book as in its multi-layered structure that it has, as a real call for action. And I really hope all of you academic activists go on pursuing your great work, and we will hear from you soon again. Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sorana.
Thank you. Ciao.